Paramedic treats dying little boy in ambulance, freezes when she sees his birthmark, the same one her son had who died at birth. Nancy had been a paramedic for over a decade, but nothing could have prepared her for the scene that awaited her on that fateful evening. As her ambulance wound its way up the treacherous mountain road, the flashing lights of emergency vehicles ahead signaled the magnitude of the disaster they were about to face. The radio crackled with urgent voices, relaying fragmented information about a bus accident involving school children. Nancy's heart raced, her mind already running through protocols and procedures. But as they rounded the final bend, the reality before her eyes surpassed even her worst expectations. The white bus lay on its side, a crumpled mass of metal against the rocky mountainside. Debris was scattered across the road, and the air was filled with a cacophony of sirens, shouts, and heart-wrenching cries. Nancy's ambulance was one of 8 that had responded to the call, joined by numerous police cars and other first responders. As she jumped out of the vehicle, the chaos enveloped her. Children in torn and bloodied clothes were scattered across the scene, some crying out in pain, others eerily silent. Teachers, themselves injured, were trying to comfort the students while battling their own shock and trauma. Nancy's training kicked in, pushing her emotions aside as she began to assess the situation. She moved swiftly from one victim to another, checking vital signs and prioritizing the most critical cases. The faces of the injured children burned into her memory, their fear, their pain, their innocence shattered in an instant. As she worked, a police officer approached her, his face grim. "We've got 5 confirmed fatalities," he reported, his voice barely audible over the surrounding chaos. 3 children, a teacher, and the bus driver. The rest are in various states of injury. It's a mess, Nancy. The weight of his words hit her like a physical blow. 5 lives lost, countless others forever changed. Nancy nodded, steeling herself for the long night ahead. She and her fellow paramedics fanned out, each taking on multiple patients, working against time to stabilize the most critical cases for transport. The mountain air grew colder as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the accident scene. Nancy moved from one injured child to another, her hands steady even as her heart ached for each young life touched by this tragedy. She whispered words of comfort, applied bandages, and monitored vital signs with practiced efficiency. As she finished stabilizing a young girl with a likely concussion, Nancy's eyes were drawn to a small figure lying nearby. A boy, no more than 5 or 6 years old, lay motionless on the ground. His blue shirt was torn and stained, his small body covered in cuts and bruises. But it was the dark purple bruise on his chest that sent a chill through Nancy's spine. She rushed to his side, her trained eyes quickly taking in his condition. His breathing was shallow and labored, his skin pale and cool to the touch. A name tag sticker on what remained of his shirt read Colton, a poignant reminder of the field trip that had turned into a nightmare. Nancy gently felt for a pulse, relief washing over her as she detected a faint but steady beat. The bruise on his chest worried her. Broken ribs were a real possibility, and internal injuries couldn't be ruled out. But there was something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. A warmth, a connection she felt to this child that went beyond her professional concern. "I need a stretcher over here now," she called out to her partner. "We've got a critical case, possible internal injuries. He needs immediate transport." As she waited for the stretcher, Nancy held Colton's small hand in hers, willing strength into his fragile body. "Hold on, little one," she whispered. "We're going to get you help. Just hold on." The ambulance's rear doors slammed shut, sealing Nancy and her precious cargo inside the vehicle. Colton lay strapped to the stretcher, his small frame dwarfed by the medical equipment surrounding him. Beside him, another stretcher held a blonde girl, her condition even more critical than Colton's. As the ambulance lurched into motion, its siren wailing into the night, Nancy's mind raced. She moved between the 2 children, checking vitals, adjusting IVs, and monitoring their conditions with laser focus. The winding mountain road made her task even more challenging, each turn threatening to upset the delicate balance she was struggling to maintain. Nancy's eyes kept returning to Colton. Despite the gravity of the situation, she couldn't shake the strange feeling of connection she felt towards him. It was more than just professional concern. There was something about this boy that tugged at her heart in a way she couldn't explain. The blonde girl's condition deteriorated rapidly. Nancy's heart sank as she realized the girl's injuries were too severe. Despite her best efforts, the girl's pulse weakened and then stopped altogether. Nancy performed CPR, her movements automatic, but deep down she knew it was futile. With a heavy heart, she had to declare the girl dead. The loss hit Nancy hard. In her years as a paramedic, she had seen death before, but losing a child always struck a particularly painful chord. She allowed herself a brief moment of grief before refocusing her attention on Colton. She was determined not to lose him too. As the ambulance sped through the night, Nancy held Colton's hand, offering what comfort she could. His breathing remained shallow but stable. She spoke to him softly, words of encouragement and reassurance, even though she wasn't sure he could hear her. It was then, as she gently adjusted Colton's arm, that Nancy noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat. On the inside of his arm, just below the elbow, was a birthmark. It wasn't just any birthmark, it was a distinct shape, one that Nancy recognized instantly. Her mind reeled as memories flooded back, memories of a cold operating room, of a tiny baby she had barely glimpsed before he was whisked away. Her son, the one she had been told had died shortly after birth, had had an identical birthmark. Nancy's hands began to shake as she stared at the mark on Colton's arm. It couldn't be possible, could it? The rational part of her mind tried to dismiss the idea, but her heart raced with a wild, impossible hope. She was jolted from her thoughts as Colton stirred, his eyes fluttering open weakly. Nancy leaned in close, speaking gently. "Hey there, Colton. You're safe now. You're in an ambulance and we're taking you to the hospital. My name is Nancy and I'm here to take care of you." Colton's eyes, filled with fear and confusion, locked onto hers. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but Nancy shushed him gently. "It's okay, sweetie. You don't need to talk. Just rest now. You're going to be all right." Tears welled up in the boy's eyes, and Nancy felt her own eyes misting over in response. She squeezed his hand reassuringly, and Colton seemed to relax slightly, his eyes drifting closed once more. As Colton fell back into unconsciousness, Nancy found herself unable to look away from the birthmark on his arm. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions and emotions. Could it really be possible? Could this boy somehow be connected to the son she thought she had lost? Nancy shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. She needed to focus on her job, on getting Colton safely to the hospital. The ambulance continued its journey through the night, carrying with it a boy fighting for his life and a woman whose world had just been turned upside down. As the lights of the city came into view, Nancy steeled herself for what was to come. After what felt like an eternity, the ambulance finally pulled into the hospital's emergency bay. The doors burst open, and Nancy helped guide Colton's stretcher out, rattling off his condition to the waiting trauma team. The ER was a whirlwind of activity, filled with the victims of the bus crash and the medical staff working frantically to save lives. As Colton was whisked away behind a curtain, Nancy found herself momentarily at a loss. Her job was done, but she felt an overwhelming urge to stay close to the boy. She hovered near the nurse's station, her eyes constantly darting to the curtain hiding Colton from view. The ER was quickly filling up with more children from the crash site. Parents began to arrive, their faces etched with fear and worry. Nancy watched as they were directed to a waiting area, the air thick with tension and unspoken dread. A woman approached Nancy, her eyes wild with panic. "My daughter, Sarah, she was on the bus. Please, can you tell me where she is?" Nancy opened her mouth to respond, but found herself unable to form words. The image of the blonde girl who had died in the ambulance flashed through her mind. Could this be her mother? The weight of potential grief was suffocating. Before Nancy could gather herself, a nurse gently intervened, guiding the distraught mother away. Nancy watched them go, feeling a mix of relief and guilt. She knew she should be better at handling these situations, but tonight, everything felt different, As more parents arrived, their anxious voices filled the air. Nancy overheard snippets of conversations, worried inquiries about injuries, tearful reunions, and in some cases, the devastating news of loss. Each interaction seemed to chip away at her usual professional detachment. Nancy found herself drawn back to the curtain hiding Colton. She peered around it, watching as doctors and nurses worked on him. His small form looked even tinier amidst the medical equipment. The birthmark on his arm was still visible, and Nancy felt that inexplicable pull once more. A hand on her shoulder made her jump. It was Andrew, her manager, looking concerned. "Nancy, are you all right? You look like you can use a breath of fresh air." Nancy nodded automatically, but Andrew's kindness cracked her facade. It's been a tough night," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew's eyes softened with understanding. "I know, this is a bad one. Why don't you take a break? Maybe head home early if you need to. No one would blame you after what you've seen tonight." Nancy shook her head. "No, I need to stay. There's a boy, Colton. I brought him in and I need to make sure he's okay." Andrew looked at her closely, clearly noting her unusual attachment, but he didn't push. "All right, but promise me you'll take care of yourself too, okay? And let me know if you need anything." As Andrew walked away, Nancy felt a wave of gratitude for his understanding, but it was quickly overshadowed by the turmoil of emotions swirling within her. The chaos of the ER, the weight of the tragedy, and the mystery of Colton all pressed down on her. She found herself moving through the ER in a daze, her mind constantly circling back to Colton and the impossible questions his birthmark had raised. The rational part of her knew she should let it go and focus on her job, but her heart wouldn't let her. The relentless wail of ambulance sirens and the constant influx of patients and medical staff weighed heavily on Nancy, the intensity of the night finally becoming unbearable. She stumbled out of the ER into the cool night air of the ambulance bay, craving just a little moment of silence and space. Her weary legs led her to a secluded bench, where she sank, her body trembling with exhaustion and raw emotion. As she sat there, the full impact of what she had witnessed hit her like a physical blow. The overturned bus, the broken bodies of children, the anguished cries of parents. It all replayed in her mind with vivid clarity. Nancy closed her eyes, but the images only seemed to grow more intense. Her chest tightened, and she found herself struggling to breathe. The world around her began to blur, the sounds of the hospital fading into a dull roar. Nancy recognized the signs of an impending panic attack, something she hadn't experienced in years. She gripped the edges of the bench, trying to ground herself, but the panic continued to rise. Her hands trembled, and her vision swam. The faces of the injured children flashed before her eyes, interspersed with memories of her own loss. The son she had never held, the grief she had carried for so long. Just as Nancy felt she might be swept away by the tide of her emotions, a familiar voice cut through the fog. "Hey, Nancy, are you feeling better? Do you think you're up for coming with me to the scene?" She looked up to see Andrew, her manager, standing before her, unaware of her inner turmoil. He held his walkie-talkie in one hand, concern etched across his face. Nancy could faintly hear chatter from the radio about another emergency. Something about a child beaten unconscious by a nanny. The world seemed determined to pile tragedy upon tragedy. Nancy shook her head, barely able to muster the strength to respond. Finally, she whispered, I can't, Andrew. Not right now." She looked away, her voice breaking. "Another injured child, especially one hurt by someone who should have cared for them. I just can't do it." Andrew, now aware that she was struggling, immediately sat beside her, offering a steadying presence. "Nancy, talk to me," he said gently. "What's going on?" Nancy shook her head again, tears welling in her eyes. Andrew placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's okay," he said softly. "This has been a tough night. What you saw out there, it would shake anyone. There's no shame in being affected by it." His kindness broke through Nancy's defenses, and she felt tears begin to fall. I can't stop seeing their faces," she whispered. "The children, the parents, and Colton. There's something about him, Andrew. I can't explain it, but I feel connected to him somehow." Andrew listened patiently, his face a mixture of concern and understanding. "Nancy, I think maybe you should consider taking some time off. This job, it takes a toll on all of us. There's no weakness in needing a break." Nancy nodded, grateful for his support, but something inside her rebelled against the idea of leaving. "I'll be fine." Andrew studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. Promise me you'll take care of yourself, okay? I'll find another paramedic to come with me to the scene. You don't worry about it." As Andrew walked away, Nancy took a deep breath, feeling the panic begin to subside. She was still shaken, still overwhelmed by the night's events, but something else was growing stronger within her, a determination to understand the connection she felt to Colton. Nancy re-entered the bustling ER, her heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and determination. The chaos around her seemed to fade into the background as she focused on her goal. She approached the nurse's station, trying to appear calm and professional despite the turmoil inside her. A harried-looking nurse glanced up at her approach. "Excuse me," Nancy started, her voice soft and hesitant. "I'm looking for information on a patient brought in earlier, a young boy named Colton from the bus accident. Could you tell me his room number?" The nurse's eyes narrowed slightly. "Are you family?" Nancy hesitated. "No, I'm the paramedic who brought him in. I just wanted to check on his condition." The nurse shook her head firmly. "I'm sorry, but I can't disclose patient information to non-family members. It's against hospital policy." Nancy felt a surge of frustration. "Please, I just need to know if he's okay and if there's any information about his background, his family." "Ma'am," the nurse cut her off, her tone sharp. "I've already told you I can't give out that information, even if you're a paramedic who saved him. You should have known that before asking me." Nancy felt a wave of desperation wash over her. She stepped back from the counter, her mind racing. She knew she was crossing a line, pushing beyond the boundaries of her professional role, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to know more about Colton. Finding a quiet corner, Nancy pulled out her phone. With trembling hands, she removed the case, revealing a worn photograph hidden inside. It was a picture she had carried with her for years, a constant reminder of her loss. The photo captured a newborn baby, small and perfect, lying in a hospital bassinet. Nancy's gaze settled, as it always did, on the distinctive birthmark on the baby's arm, the same one she had seen on Colton. The hospital tag still clung to the baby's tiny, crusted leg, with faint smears of blood and traces of white amniotic fluid, a reminder of just how recently he had entered the world. As she stared at the photograph, memories flooded back. She was transported to that day in Laos, the day her world had changed forever. Nancy had been young and alone, far from home and family. The labor had been difficult, and she remembered the fear that had gripped her as she was alone and rushed into the operating room for an emergency C-section. The details were hazy, clouded by pain and the drugs they had given her, but she remembered the moment of joy when she heard her baby's cry, weak but unmistakable. She had barely glimpsed him before the medical team whisked him away, citing concerns about his breathing. Hours later, groggy and disoriented, Nancy had woken in the recovery room. Her first thought had been of her son, and she had called for a nurse, eager to hold him, to begin the journey of motherhood. But the nurse who came bore devastating news. Nancy's baby had died, they told her. Something about neonatal asphyxia, a condition that had prevented his lungs from working properly. They assured her it was a common complication for premature babies, that there was nothing that could have been done. Nancy remembered the numbness that had washed over her, the disbelief. She had heard him cry, how could he be gone? She had begged to see him, to hold him just once, but they had refused, citing ongoing medical examinations. In her grief and exhaustion, Nancy had accepted their explanations, but as she stared at Colton's birthmark, identical to the one in the photo, Doubts that had long lain dormant began to surface. Why hadn't they let her see her son's body? Why had the details of his death been so vague? And how could Colton, a boy of about the right age, have the exact same distinctive birthmark? Nancy's hands shook as she carefully replaced the photo in her phone case. The rational part of her mind tried to dismiss the idea forming in her head. It was impossible, surely. But her heart raced with a wild, desperate hope. Andrew's suggestion to take the night off echoed in her mind, offering a tempting escape from the emotional storm churning within her. For a moment, she thought about heading to the exit, craving the solace of distance and a chance to process everything that had happened. But as she took a step in that direction and passed the nurse's station, she noticed something unusual. It was completely empty. The usual bustle was momentarily stilled, likely because every nurse had been pulled to the emergency room, leaving the station deserted. Nancy's heart began to race as she realized the opportunity before her. She glanced around, confirming that no one was watching. The ethical part of her mind screamed in protest, reminding her of the serious breach of protocol she was about to commit. But the pull of the mystery surrounding Colton was too strong to resist. With trembling hands, Nancy leaned over the counter, her eyes quickly scanning the patient information board. Rows of names and room numbers blurred before her until she found what she was looking for. Colton, room 1107. Relief and anxiety flooded through her in equal measure as she committed the number to memory. She straightened up, her mind racing with the implications of what she was about to do. She knew she was risking her career, her reputation, everything she had worked for. But in that moment, none of it seemed to matter compared to the chance of uncovering the truth about Colton and the connection she felt to him. Nancy took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. She turned away from the nurse's station, her steps purposeful, as she headed towards the elevators. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was crossing a line from which there was no return. But with each step, her resolve only grew stronger. The elevator doors closed behind her, and Nancy pressed the button for the 11th floor. As the car began to ascend, she closed her eyes, trying to calm her racing heart. She knew that whatever she discovered in room 1107 had the potential to change her life forever. The soft ding of the elevator reaching its destination jolted Nancy back to the present. As the doors slid open, she stepped out into the quiet corridor of the pediatric ward. Room 1107 lay ahead, and with it, the answers she had been seeking for so long. With a final moment of hesitation, Nancy gathered her courage and moved forward. She was no longer just a paramedic doing her job. She was a woman on a mission to uncover a truth that had eluded her for years. Whatever consequences awaited her, she was ready to face them head-on. Nancy's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the room. The corridor was eerily quiet, the soft beeping of medical equipment and distant murmurs of conversation, the only sounds breaking the silence. As she neared Colton's room, she noticed the door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out into the hallway. Cautiously, Nancy peered through the gap. Inside, she saw two figures standing by Colton's bed, a man and a woman who she assumed were his parents. She held her breath, watching intently, feeling like an intruder but unable to look away. Colton's mother sat close to the bed, her face etched with worry. She reached out, gently holding Colton's small hand in hers. The tenderness of the gesture made Nancy's heart ache, a mix of emotions swirling within her. Jealousy, longing, and a strange sense of gratitude that Colton had known a mother's love. Beside her stood Colton's father, his posture tense, his eyes fixed on his son. The concern on his face was evident, but there was something else, a distraction, a restlessness that seemed at odds with the gravity of the situation. As Nancy watched, he saw the man reached out into his pocket. His phone vibrated. He glanced at it, a flash of frustration crossing his face before he stepped out of the room to take the call. Nancy pressed herself against the wall, her heart racing as Colton's father emerged into the hallway. She strained to hear his conversation, catching fragments that painted a picture of a man torn between his family and his professional life. Yes, I understand the company needs me, he was saying, his voice low but firm. But my son is in the hospital. The deal will have to wait. No. He rubbed his eyes and pinched the temple of his nose. Okay, I'll come to the office now. Yes, with my wife. I mean Mrs. Harrington from the executive. I'll call you back. As he ended the call, his eyes fell on Nancy. The stress and worry of the night seemed to fuel his irritation, and his expression hardened as he took a step toward her. Hey, what are you doing here? He demanded, his voice sharp with accusation. Why are you hanging around outside my son's room? Nancy felt her throat tighten, caught off guard by his aggressive tone. She scrambled to explain, trying to keep her voice steady and professional. I'm the paramedic who treated your son at the accident scene, sir. I just wanted to check on him to see how he was doing. Her explanation did little to soften the father's anger. If anything, he seemed to grow more agitated. You've done your job, he snapped, his voice rising. Patient follow-ups are the doctor's responsibility, not the paramedics. I don't need you lurking outside our son's room. Go back to work and let the hospital staff handle this. Sure. The harshness of his words stung Nancy, but before she could respond, Colton's mother appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of raised voices. Her expression softened when she saw Nancy, a small, grateful smile crossing her face. You're the paramedic who helped Colton, she asked, her voice gentle. Thank you so much for what you did. I'm Amelia, Colton's mother. She reached out her hand. Nancy felt a rush of warmth at the mother's kindness, seeing in her eyes a depth of gratitude that her husband's anger couldn't diminish. I'm Nandi. She reached out her hand to accept the woman's handshake. I'm sorry for... People like her are the reason this small-town hospital has lower recovery rates than the ones in the city, Amelia. You should stop treating them like we owe them. For a moment, it seemed as if the mother wanted to say more, to share her fears, or ask about Nancy's experience at the accident scene. But her husband's continued irritation held her back, and she remained reserved, constrained by the tension in the air. Despite his wife's expression of gratitude, Colton's father maintained his cold stance. I think it's time for you to leave, he said to Nancy, his tone leaving no room for argument. We appreciate what you did at the accident, but your job here is done. Nancy nodded, taking a step back. She felt frustrated and concerned, her thoughts still on Colton and the connection she felt to him. As she began to walk away, she caught a final, sympathetic look from Colton's mother, who seemed torn between her gratitude and her husband's hostility. From further down the corridor, Nancy observed as the father turned to his wife. We should go, he said, his voice still edged with frustration. We need to get back to the office. Something came up with our deal involving the new partner, and they requested both of us. He sighed. This hospital staff is inefficient, and I'm tired of waiting around for updates. The mother hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave Colton's side. But what if something changes? What if he wakes up and we're not here? The hospital will call us if there's any change, the father assured her, his tone softening slightly. Come on, we both need to go and deal with this work situation. With visible reluctance, the mother nodded. She turned back to Colton's room, giving her son one last lingering look and a kiss. Her face was a canvas of worry and sadness as she finally followed her husband towards the elevators. As they disappeared from view, Nancy felt a mix of emotions washing over her. The father's hostility and the mother's kindness, the obvious love they both had for Colton despite their different ways of showing it. It all swirled in her mind, adding new layers to the mystery she was trying to unravel. With Colton's parents finally out of sight, Nancy felt a surge of both relief and urgency. This was her chance, perhaps her only chance, to get closer to the truth that had been haunting her since she first saw Colton's birthmark. She took a quick look around the corridor, ensuring no one was nearby, then stepped towards room 1107. Her hand trembled slightly as she pushed the door open and slipped inside, closing it quietly behind her. The room was dimly lit, the soft beeping of monitors providing a steady rhythm in the background, and there in the center of it all lay Colton. Nancy moved to his bedside, her eyes taking in every detail of his peaceful, sleeping face. He looked so small and vulnerable amidst the medical equipment surrounding him. Her gaze was drawn to his arm, where the birthmark that had started this whole journey was clearly visible. It was identical to the one on her son, the son she had been told had died at birth. Emotions swirled within her, hope, grief, disbelief, all intertwining, as she struggled to comprehend the impossible connection she felt. Gently, almost reverently, she brushed a strand of hair from Colton's forehead. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a soft whisper, as if she was afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter the moment. "Hi," she began hesitantly, the word catching in her throat. She paused, gathering her courage before continuing. I'm your mother. At least I think I am." The words hung in the air, both a declaration and a question. Nancy's eyes never left Colton's face as she began to speak, her voice growing stronger as she poured out the story she had carried in her heart for so long. "5 years ago I was in Laos," she began. "I had fallen in love with a local man, your father, and we got married. When I found out I was pregnant, I was so happy. But as my pregnancy progressed, things got complicated. My husband, your father, he left me. I was alone in a foreign country, scared and uncertain about the future." Nancy's voice broke as she recalled the fear and isolation she had felt during those difficult months. "When I went into labor, it was too early. They rushed me into surgery for an emergency C-section. The hospital, it wasn't like the ones back home. It was underfunded with minimal resources. I was terrified, praying that you would be okay." She paused, her hand gently stroking Colton's arm, tracing the outline of the birthmark. "I remember waiting to hear your cry. It felt like an eternity. And then finally I heard it. Just a small, weak sound, but it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard." Tears began to form in Nancy's eyes as she continued. "But they took you away so quickly. I barely got to see you. Hours later, when I woke up, they told me you had died. Something about your lungs not working properly. I was devastated, broken in a way I didn't think I could ever recover from." Her voice dropped to a whisper, heavy with regret. I'm so sorry I believed them. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder to see you, to hold you. I was scared and I was alone, but that's no excuse. I should have known, should have felt that you were still out there somewhere." Nancy's eyes roamed over Colton's face, memorizing every detail. "But you're here now. Somehow, against all odds, you found your way back to me. I don't know how or why, but I promise you, I'm going to find out the truth, and I'm going to be here for you no matter what." She leaned down, placing a soft kiss on Colton's forehead. "I love you," she whispered. "I've always loved you, even when I thought you were gone, and I'll always be here for you no matter what happens next." As Nancy straightened up, wiping tears from her eyes, she felt a mix of emotions she couldn't quite name. There was sorrow for the years lost, joy at this impossible reunion, and a steely determination to uncover the full truth of what had happened. But beneath it all was a sense of peace, as if a piece of her that had been missing for so long had finally clicked into place. Nancy sat by Colton's bedside, her heart full of a bittersweet mixture of love and longing. She had just poured out years of pent-up emotions, speaking to the son she thought she had lost. The room was quiet, save for the steady beeping of monitors, and Nancy felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps shattered the tranquil moment. Nancy's head snapped up, her body tensing as she realized Colton's parents were returning. Before she could move, the door swung open, and Colton's mother and father stepped into the room. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stand still. The parents froze in the doorway, their eyes widening as they took in the scene before them. Nancy sitting beside their son's bed, her hand resting gently on his arm. Shock and anger flashed across their faces, the father's expression particularly thunderous. "What are you doing here?" the father demanded, his voice rising in fury. He strode forward, positioning himself between Nancy and Colton's bed. "I told you to stay away. How dare you sneak into our son's room?" Nancy stood up, her legs shaky but her resolve firm. She knew this moment would come, but facing the reality of it was more daunting than she had imagined. "I'm sorry," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I know I shouldn't be here, but I had to see him. There's something you need to know." "Get out," the father interrupted, his face red with anger. "You have no right to be here. This is a complete violation of our privacy and your professional boundaries." Nancy could see the mother's face behind her husband. A mixture of confusion and concern etched across her features. She knew she had only one chance to make them understand. "Please listen to me," Nancy pleaded, her voice growing stronger with desperation. "I believe Colton is my son. I lost my baby 5 years ago, and Colton has the same birthmark my son had. I think there's been a terrible mistake." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The father's face shifted from anger to disbelief, then back to fury. The mother, however, seemed frozen, her eyes wide with shock. "That's impossible," the father sputtered. "You're clearly delusional. I'm calling security right now." He strode to the door, shouting for hospital staff. Within moments, nurses and security personnel rushed into the room. They quickly moved to restrain Nancy, pulling her away from Colton's bedside. She struggled against their grip, her eyes never leaving Colton. "Please," she cried out, her voice breaking. "That's my son. You don't understand. They told me he died, but he has the same birthmark. You have to listen to me." The commotion seemed to wake something in Colton's mother. She stepped forward, her face pale and her hands shaking. "Wait," she said softly, but her voice was lost in the chaos. The father, his face a mask of anger and fear, pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the police," he announced. "This woman is clearly unstable and a threat to our family." As Nancy was led from the room, she could see the conflict on the mother's face. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Nancy saw a flicker of something. Doubt, perhaps, or a dawning realization. But then the moment passed, and Nancy found herself in the hallway, surrounded by security staff. The father's voice carried from the room as he spoke to the 911 operator, insisting on immediate police assistance. He described Nancy as a dangerous individual who had invaded their privacy and posed a potential threat to their son. Nancy felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had known the risks when she decided to confront the truth, but the reality of the situation was overwhelming. As she was held in the hallway, waiting for the police to arrive, she clung to the memory of Colton's face, to the birthmark that had started this all. Whatever happened next, Nancy knew she couldn't give up. Somehow she had to find a way to prove the truth, to unravel the mystery that had brought her to this moment. As the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, Nancy steeled herself for the battle ahead, determined to fight for the son she had only just found. The hospital corridor erupted into a flurry of activity as 2 police officers arrived, responding to the urgent call from Colton's father. The officers, their faces set in professional neutrality, approached the group gathered outside room 1107. Colton's father stepped forward, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and distress. "Officers, thank you for coming so quickly. My name's Harold Harrington, and this is my wife, Mia Harrington," he said, taking his wife's hand, his voice tight with emotion. "This woman," he pointed accusingly at Nancy, "who said herself our son's paramedic, broke into our son's hospital room. She's claiming to be his mother, saying our son is actually hers. It's completely delusional and causing unnecessary distress to our family." The officers listened attentively, their eyes moving between Harold and Nancy, who stood quietly, her face pale but determined. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, turned to Nancy. "Ma'am, can you explain your side of the story?" Nancy took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew this might be her only chance to be heard. "My name is Nancy Wells. I'm a paramedic, and I was part of the team that responded to the bus accident earlier tonight. When I was treating Colton, I noticed he had a birthmark identical to one my son had, a son I was told died 5 years ago in Laos." Her voice trembled slightly as she continued, "I know how this sounds, but please, you have to listen. I have a photograph of my baby, taken just after he was born. It shows the birthmark. The officer nodded, his expression neutral but not unkind. Do you have this photograph with you? Nancy nodded, reaching for her phone with shaking hands. She carefully removed the case and extracted the worn photograph she had carried for so long. Here, she said, handing it to the officer. You can see the birthmark on his arm. The officer examined the photo closely, then passed it to his partner. They exchanged a glance before the first officer handed the photo to Colton's mother, who had been standing silently throughout the exchange. As Colton's mother took the photograph, her face paled. Her hands trembled as she stared at the image, her eyes widening in recognition. Slowly, she reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet. With shaking fingers, she extracted a small photo and held it next to Nancy's. The room fell silent as everyone leaned in to look. The two photos, placed side by side, showed striking similarities. Not just the distinctive birthmark, but the shape of the baby's face, his hair, and the curve of his tiny fingers. Harold's face paled as the implications of the situation sank in. He turned to the police officers, his voice shaky but firm. This is a misunderstanding. We adopted Colton legally in Laos. There must be some explanation for this. The older officer, sensing the delicacy of the situation, spoke calmly. Sir, ma'am, I think we need to take this conversation somewhere more private, so not to disturb other patients, and we'll need to involve child services to investigate this matter thoroughly. And Nancy, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mixture of hope and disbelief, finally found her voice. Please, she said, addressing both the officers and Colton's parents. I know this is shocking and confusing for everyone, but all I want is to understand what happened to my son. If Colton is really my child, I have a right to know. The mother, still clutching both photographs, looked at Nancy with tear-filled eyes. I'm so sorry, she whispered. We never knew. We were told he had been abandoned. Harold, struggling to process this revelation, turned to Mia. We need to explain everything. Now. As the group began to move down the hallway, led by the officers, Nancy felt a whirlwind of emotions. Relief at finally being heard, fear of what might come next, and an overwhelming desire to return to Colton's side. She cast one last glance at the door to room 1107, silently promising the boy inside that she would uncover the truth, no matter what it took. The next few hours passed in a blur of questions, statements, and barely contained emotions. In a small conference room, Colton's mother, her voice shaky but determined, recounted the story of how they had come to adopt Colton, with the father occasionally adding details or confirming parts of the story. We were in Laos visiting my brother who was very ill, Mia began. The day he died, I was devastated. We wandered into the hospital's neonatal unit, finding comfort in the sight of the newborns. That's when a nurse approached us. She went on to explain how the nurse had told them about a newborn whose mother had allegedly abandoned him. The nurse had suggested that adopting the baby immediately would be the quickest way to give him a home, and since the baby was just born, he needed the essential skin-to-skin contact for bonding. She had assured them she would handle the paperwork later, emphasizing how important those early moments were for the baby's well-being. We were grief-stricken and vulnerable, she admitted, her eyes pleading for understanding. The idea of giving this child a home, of becoming parents, of taking care of a new life after losing one, it seemed like a miracle. We didn't ask enough questions. We just wanted to believe it was meant to be. Harold nodded, his face a mixture of concern and regret. We thought we were doing the right thing, he added. We had no idea there could be any irregularities in the adoption. As the story unfolded, Nancy felt a mix of anger and sympathy. The deception ran deep, affecting not just her but this couple who had raised Colton as their own for 5 years. The police officers listened closely, taking careful notes. This investigation could require involving international authorities, one of them said. This crosses borders and has signs of potential child trafficking. It's going to be a complex case. We'll also need your full cooperation to review all the legal documents regarding the boy's adoption. They continued discussing the legalities, But Nancy's head spun with the implications. Her son hadn't died. He had been stolen, sold to an unsuspecting couple under the guise of adoption. The grief she'd carried for years ignited into a fierce need for justice. Colton's father, who had been silent for much of the confession, finally spoke. "But what's going to happen to our family now?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Colton is our son. We've raised him, loved him. You can't just take him away. He'll be devastated." The older officer sighed, his face sympathetic but firm. "For now, nothing changes immediately. Child services will be involved, and there will likely be DNA tests to confirm parentage. The courts will ultimately decide on custody arrangements, taking into account what's best for the child." Nancy felt her heart clench at the thought of potentially losing Colton again, just when she had found him. "I don't want to take him away from the only parents he's known," she said softly. "I just want to be part of his life, to know him." Mia gently touched Nancy's arm. "Nancy, I know this isn't easy, but breaking this news to Colton is going to be really hard. I hope you understand that. Maybe we should start slowly." Nancy nodded. "I understand. I just want the best for him." "I know we have a long road ahead," Harold said quietly, "but I want you to know, I'm now grateful Colton has you as the paramedic who saved him, that he has someone else who loves him as much as we do. Whatever happens, I hope we can find a way to do what's best for him." Nancy's tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "That's all I want too." The room fell silent as the weight of the situation settled over everyone. Lives had been irrevocably changed in the span of a few hours, and the path forward was uncertain. As the meeting wrapped up and the police granted everyone a break while awaiting child services, Nancy felt a blend of exhaustion and resolve. The night's events had been overwhelming, yet she knew this was only the start. There were still many questions to resolve, legal hurdles ahead, and, above all, a young boy who needed protection and unwavering care through everything to come. Taking a deep breath, Nancy turned to the police officers, Mia and Harold. "I know this is a complicated situation," she began, her voice soft but determined. "But while we're waiting, would it be possible for me to see Colton? Just for a moment?" The room fell silent. The older police officer exchanged glances with his partner before addressing Colton's parents. "Ultimately, this decision is up to you," he said. "You are still Colton's legal guardians at this point." Harold's face tightened, a mix of emotions playing across his features, but it was Mia who spoke first, her voice trembling but resolute. "Yes," she said, looking directly at Nancy. I think that would be okay." Harold turned to her, surprise evident in his expression. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "We've always tried to do what's best for Colton," she said. "And right now, I think this is the right thing to do." The older officer nodded. "All right then. I'll accompany you to Colton's room. We'll need to keep this brief, and I'll need to stay with you the entire time. There should be no claim of you being his birth mother, not while he's still in the hospital, and not until we have DNA confirmation." "Yes, officer," Nancy said, then turned to Mia and Harold. "I promise." As they made their way back to room 1107, Nancy's heart raced. She had dreamed of this moment for 5 years, yet nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it. When they entered the room, Colton was awake, looking small and confused in the large hospital bed. "Hey, buddy," Mia said gently, moving to his bedside. "How are you feeling?" Colton's eyes moved from his mother to Nancy, curiosity evident in his gaze. "I'm okay," he said softly. "Who's that?" Nancy stepped forward, her legs feeling unsteady. "Hi, Colton," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Nancy. I'm the paramedic who helped you after the accident." Recognition flickered in Colton's eyes. "I remember you," he said. "You made me feel better." Tears welled in Nancy's eyes, but she blinked them back, determined to stay strong for Colton. "That's right," she said, smiling. "And I wanted to come check on you to see how you're doing." Colton nodded, then looked at his mother questioningly. She stroked his hair gently. It's okay, sweetheart. Nancy is here to help. Nancy moved closer to the bed, her eyes taking in every detail of Colton's face. She could see hints of herself in his features, and her heart ached with a mixture of joy and sorrow for the years they had lost. "Colton," she said softly, "I want you to know that there are a lot of people who care about you very much, and we're all going to make sure you're safe and happy, okay?" Colton nodded, a small smile forming on his face. "Okay," he said. Then, with the innocence of a child, he added, "Will you come back and visit me?" Nancy's heart swelled with emotion. She glanced at Mia, who gave a small, tearful nod. "Yes, Colton," Nancy replied, her voice thick with feeling. "I'd love to come visit you again." As Nancy, Harold, and Mia stood in Colton's room, a gentle knock on the door interrupted their tense silence. A woman in a crisp suit entered, her demeanor professional, yet compassionate. "I'm Sarah Thompson from Child Protective Services," she introduced herself. "I need to speak with Mrs. Wells and Mr. Harrington in private. Mrs. Harrington, you're welcome to stay with your son." Colton, sensing the shift in atmosphere, looked up at his parents with worried eyes. "What's happening? Where are you going? Is something wrong?" Mia leaned down, stroking Colton's hair gently. "It's okay, sweetheart. Daddy just needs to take care of something important. I'll stay here with you, and we'll let you know everything once you're feeling better and back home, okay?" Colton nodded, still looking uncertain but comforted by his mother's presence. In the conference room, Sarah listened intently as Nancy and Harold recounted their stories. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, years of secrets and unknowns finally coming to light. After hearing both sides, Sarah spoke. "This is a complex situation that will require careful handling. For now, I'm advising a DNA test for Mrs. Wells to confirm biological relation. Mr. Harrington, I'll need you to bring all adoption documents to my office at our next appointment. Until we have more information and can make informed decisions, Colton will finish his recovery and return to the Harringtons' home as planned." Nancy felt a mix of relief and anxiety at the decision. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a step forward. As Sarah prepared to leave, she addressed them both. "I know this is difficult for everyone involved. Our primary concern is Colton's well-being. We'll work together to ensure the best outcome for him." Just as Sarah exited, Nancy's phone rang. It was Andrew, her paramedic manager. "Nancy, how are you feeling?" Andrew's voice was laced with concern. "I hope you're doing better. Listen, we've got another emergency call. There's a house fire in Oakwood Heights. 2 elderly couples are injured. Are you up for it?" Nancy paused, glancing at Harold and then toward Colton's room. The night's events had been overwhelming, but she felt a renewed sense of strength and a familiar pull toward her duty as a paramedic, the deep instinct to help those in need. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I'll be there. I'll see you in the emergency bay." Nancy put her phone back into her pocket, her eyes meeting Harold's. For a moment they stood in silence, but then, with a voice thick with emotion, Nancy spoke. "Mr. Harrington, I have to go. There's an emergency call." She paused. "I know we have a lot to figure out, and this situation is far from simple. But if I may, please tell Colton—" Her voice broke slightly, and she took a deep breath before continuing. "Tell him that I'll visit again soon." Harold's face softened, the hostility from earlier replaced by a mix of understanding and uncertainty. He nodded slowly. "I will, Nancy, and thank you for caring about him so much. We'll work this out somehow." Nancy reached out, hesitantly placing a hand on Harold's arm. "We will, for Colton's sake." She gave him a small, sad smile. "Take care of him, and take care of yourselves too." With a final nod and a last glance towards Colton's room, Nancy squared her shoulders and headed down the corridor. Her steps quickened as she approached the ambulance bay, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As she climbed into the ambulance, Nancy felt a strange sense of balance. The night had brought unimaginable changes to her life, but it had also reminded her of her purpose. She was a mother who had found her long-lost son, but she was also a paramedic with a job to do. The ambulance pulled out of the hospital, sirens wailing. Nancy took a deep breath, focusing on the task at hand. She knew that whatever the future held, custody battles, legal proceedings, building a relationship with Colton, she would face it with the same strength and compassion she brought to every emergency call. The ambulance sped into the night, carrying Nancy towards her next challenge and towards a future filled with newfound hope.